Jacob Brennan's trading post sat in a narrow canyon in northern Arizona, where red sandstone walls rose 300 feet on either side, creating natural protection and a sense of isolation that made it perfect for neutral commerce. The year was 1879, and Jake had operated his post for 6 years, building a reputation that made his establishment valuable to people who rarely agreed on anything else. Apache bands traded deer hides and handcrafted goods for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Mexican traders stopped to rest their pack animals and exchange news about routes and conditions, and white settlers found fair prices without the judgment or hostility they might encounter in more partisan establishments. Jake's neutrality wasn't just good business practice, but a carefully maintained principle that required constant vigilance and occasional personal sacrifice. He turned away customers whose prejudices made others uncomfortable, refused to serve as an information source for either military patrols or Apache scouts looking for intelligence about their opponents, and kept his opinions about territorial politics private, even when silence cost him friendships. The trading post existed because people trusted Jake to maintain boundaries that everyone else seemed determined to violate. The 2 Apache women who arrived on a warm October afternoon didn't immediately strike Jake as unusual customers. They were well-dressed in traditional clothing, with intricate beadwork suggesting prosperity or status, and they moved with the confidence of people accustomed to traveling and conducting trade. But as Jake helped them select supplies and prepare areas where they could rest before continuing their journey, he began noticing details that suggested something more complex than a routine trading visit. The older woman, who introduced herself as Ayasha, spoke excellent English and conducted her business with the practiced ease of someone experienced in cross-cultural commerce. Her younger companion, Yanaha, said little, but watched everything with an intensity that reminded Jake of scouts evaluating terrain before a military operation. Both women carried themselves with a dignity and authority that seemed to command respect from other Apache customers in the trading post, who acknowledged them with subtle gestures that suggested deference to higher status. What really caught Jake's attention was the quality and specificity of their purchases. They weren't buying random supplies, but rather carefully selected items that suggested they planned to be away from their community for an extended period. The medical supplies, preserved foods, and practical camping equipment indicated preparation for something more significant than a simple trading journey. When Jake casually asked about their destination, Ayasha's response was polite but deliberately vague, suggesting that the purpose of their trip wasn't something she was prepared to discuss with a white trader regardless of his reputation for discretion. As evening approached and Jake began preparing to close the trading post for the night, Ayasha made a request that was unusual but not unprecedented. She asked if her sister and she could stay at the post overnight, rather than camping outside the canyon, explaining that they preferred the security of being near other people rather than isolated in the open desert. Jake had accommodated such requests before, maintaining a simple but clean back room specifically for travelers who needed secure shelter, so he agreed without hesitation or suspicion. That night, as Jake sat outside his trading post, watching stars emerge in the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls, he noticed movement among the rocks at the canyon's entrance. At first he thought it might be animals or perhaps travelers arriving late, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized he was seeing Apache warriors taking positions where they could observe the trading post without being easily visible. Their presence wasn't threatening. They made no moves toward the post and took care to position themselves where they wouldn't block access or create alarm, but their obvious intention to maintain surveillance over Jake's establishment was unmistakable. The realization that he was being watched transformed Jake's understanding of Ayasha and Yanaha's visit. These weren't ordinary travelers seeking convenient shelter, but rather women whose presence at his trading post was significant enough to warrant protective observation by skilled warriors. The question that kept Jake awake into the late hours was why Apache fighters would need to watch 2 women who were safely inside a neutral trading post run by someone with a reputation for treating all customers fairly. What were they guarding against, and why had the sisters chosen his establishment for whatever purpose had brought them here? Morning brought clarity when Jake discovered that the watching warriors hadn't left during the night, but had simply changed positions to account for daylight conditions. A new group of observers had replaced the previous night's watchers, suggesting this surveillance was organized and systematic rather than spontaneous protection. The warriors' presence wasn't hidden anymore. They wanted Jake to know he was being observed, which meant their purpose wasn't concealment, but something else that Jake couldn't yet identify. When Ayasha emerged from the back room and saw Jake looking toward the canyon entrance where warriors were now visible, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. Instead, she joined him at the trading post entrance and spoke words that would begin Jake's understanding of the extraordinary situation he'd been placed in without his knowledge or consent. "They are here to watch Jacob Brennan," Ayasha said, using his full name in a way that suggested she knew more about him than he'd revealed in their brief interactions. "To watch how you treat us, how you speak to us, whether you honor the neutrality you claim for your trading post when tested by our presence for more than a brief commercial exchange. You have a reputation for fairness, but my people have learned that reputations among white settlers often fail when circumstances become complicated or uncomfortable." Jake felt a chill despite the warming morning air, understanding that he was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated, and for purposes he didn't yet understand. The two Apache sisters weren't customers seeking shelter, but rather participants in some kind of evaluation, where Jake himself was the subject being examined. What he didn't know yet was what the test was meant to determine, or what consequences might follow from passing or failing standards he hadn't been told about and didn't fully comprehend. Over the next 3 days, as Ayasha and Yanaha remained at the trading post, and the watching warriors maintained their careful surveillance, Jake began to understand the complexity of the situation he'd been placed in. The sisters didn't simply stay hidden in the back room, but rather moved through the trading post openly, interacting with other customers, helping organize supplies, and generally making themselves present in ways that forced Jake to constantly navigate the social dynamics of having Apache women as long-term guests in an establishment that served diverse and sometimes hostile communities. The test, Jake realized, wasn't just about whether he treated the sisters with basic decency when no one was watching, but rather about how he managed the reactions of other customers who might be uncomfortable with, hostile to or suspicious of Apache presence in what they'd considered a primarily settler trading space. Mexican traders showed polite respect but obvious curiosity. White settlers ranged from cautious acceptance to barely concealed anger, and other Apache visitors treated the sisters with deference that confirmed Jake's growing suspicion that these women held significant status within their community. The morning after his conversation with Ayasha, Jake faced his first real test when a settler named Thomas Griggs arrived at the trading post and immediately became agitated upon seeing Yanaha organizing supplies near the main counter. Griggs had lost family members during Apache raids years earlier and made no secret of his hatred for all native people, regardless of their individual circumstances or intentions. His demand that Jake remove those savages from the trading post created exactly the kind of confrontation that Jake had spent 6 years trying to avoid. Jake's response, delivered in a firm but calm voice that carried to the watching warriors outside, established the pattern he would maintain throughout the sisters' stay. "This is neutral ground, Tom. Everyone who comes here peacefully is welcome, and everyone who can't maintain that peace needs to leave. The choice you have to make is whether you can conduct your business respectfully or whether you need to find another trading post." Griggs left in angry frustration, but Jake's position was clear to everyone present. Neutrality meant protecting all customers equally, even when doing so cost him business from people who expected partisan loyalty based on shared race or culture. The sisters themselves presented challenges that went beyond simply defending their right to be present. Yanaha, who Jake learned was considered a skilled hunter and warrior in her own right, clearly disagreed with her sister's more conciliatory approach to interactions with white settlers. While Ayasha would engage in friendly conversation with curious customers and answer questions about Apache culture and customs, Yanaha maintained a reserve that bordered on hostility, her expressions making clear her skepticism about whether any white person could be truly trusted regardless of their demonstrated behavior. The difference between the sisters became more apparent during a conversation Jake had with Ayasha. On the third evening of their stay, she explained that their father, Chief Cochetta, led a community facing an impossible decision about whether to accept relocation to San Carlos Reservation or attempt to maintain their traditional territories despite increasing military pressure and diminishing access to resources. The sisters represented the two main perspectives within their community. Ayasha's faction believed in negotiating for the best possible terms while maintaining cultural identity within new constraints, while Yanaha's supporters argued that reservation life would destroy Apache ways and that resistance, however costly, was preferable to surrender. Our father is a wise leader, but even wise leaders sometimes need counsel when facing choices where all paths lead to pain and loss, Ayasha told Jake as they sat outside the trading post, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. He sent us here not just to observe you, but to give each of us the chance to see how white settlers treat Apache people when they have power and no obligation to do so with kindness. Your trading post is known among my people as a place where fairness is practiced, even when it's not profitable or convenient. We are here to see if that reputation withstands close examination. Jake's growing understanding of what was at stake in the test he was undergoing created a pressure he'd never experienced during his years of maintaining trading post neutrality. He wasn't just running a business anymore, but rather serving as evidence in a debate about Apache survival and identity. His treatment of the sisters, the way he managed conflicts with hostile customers, even his casual conversations and daily routines, were being observed and evaluated as data, points that would inform a community's decision about their collective future. The weight of this responsibility became even clearer when Yanaha finally spoke to Jake directly. Late on the fourth night, when Ayasha had retired, and the two of them were alone except for the ever-present warriors watching from the canyon approaches, her words carried a challenge that made Jake understand why her faction within the Apache community resisted accommodation with white settlers. My sister believes that some white men can be trusted to treat us as human beings rather than obstacles to be removed or problems to be managed, Yanaha said, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. I tell her that even the best white men, those like you who claim to value fairness and neutrality, ultimately choose their own people when the choice becomes difficult. You treat us well now, because it costs you little and benefits your business. But when the real tests come, when choosing to honor us means losing everything you've built or facing violence from your own people, then we will see whether your neutrality is principle or merely profitable performance. The accusation stung partly because Jake recognized some truth in it. His neutrality had never been tested by circumstances where maintaining it would cost him everything or place him in direct opposition to the military and civilian authorities that ultimately controlled the territory. He'd built a successful trading post by finding the spaces where neutrality was possible and profitable. But Yanaha was right that he'd never faced the kind of choice that would prove whether his principles extended beyond convenient situations into realms where they required genuine sacrifice. As Jake lay awake that night, he understood that the observation of the warriors outside his trading post was only part of the test. The real examination was whether he would recognize the moral weight of the situation he'd been placed in and rise to meet it, or whether he would maintain comfortable neutrality, even when that neutrality served as evidence supporting Yanaha's argument that white settlers couldn't ultimately be trusted to value Apache humanity above their own interests and security. The question Jake faced wasn't just about running a fair trading post anymore, but about whether he was willing to use whatever influence his reputation gave him to advocate for justice, even when doing so might cost him the comfortable position he'd spent years building. The sacred decision Chief Cochetta was making about his community's future had somehow become entangled with questions about Jake's character and courage, and the watching warriors were waiting to see which man he would prove himself to be. The crisis that would define Jake's test came on the fifth morning when a military patrol arrived at the trading post, led by Lieutenant Warren Hayes, a young officer with more ambition than wisdom, and a reputation for aggressive enforcement of policies designed to restrict Apache movement and force compliance with relocation orders. Hayes had heard reports of Apache women staying at Jake's trading post and had come to investigate whether Jake was harboring people who should be on reservations or facilitating unauthorized travel that violated territorial restrictions. Jake's first response, delivered before Hayes could even dismount, established the boundaries he intended to maintain. "This is private property and neutral commercial ground, Lieutenant. My customers are my business, not yours, unless you have specific legal authority that overrides property rights." The statement was technically correct but politically dangerous, as military officers in Arizona Territory often operated with minimal civilian oversight and could make life very difficult for people who challenged their authority. Hayes' demand to interview Ayasha and Yanaha tested Jake's commitment to protecting his customers from harassment. The lieutenant claimed authority to verify that all Apache people were properly registered and in compliance with movement restrictions, but Jake recognized the demand as an attempt to intimidate and gather intelligence rather than legitimate law enforcement. The standoff that developed, with Hayes insisting on access and Jake refusing to allow his customers to be questioned without legal warrant or probable cause, created exactly the kind of conflict that Jake had spent years avoiding. What Jake didn't fully realize until Ayasha stepped outside to speak with Hayes directly was that the confrontation was itself part of the test the sisters and their watching warriors had been conducting. Ayasha's willingness to present herself to military authority, despite Jake's protests, wasn't surrender, but rather a deliberate choice to see how Jake would respond when faced with a situation where protecting Apache people meant directly opposing white authority. The conversation between Ayasha and Lieutenant Hayes revealed the broader political context of the sisters' visit to Jake's trading post. Hayes knew exactly who Ayasha and Yanaha were, the daughters of a chief who had so far refused to bring his community to San Carlos Reservation despite increasing pressure to do so. The lieutenant's interest in the sisters wasn't about enforcing general movement restrictions, but rather about gathering intelligence that might help military commanders pressure Chief Cocheta into compliance. Jake's intervention, when Hayes began asking questions clearly designed to elicit information about the location and size of the chief's community, crossed a line that Jake had previously refused to approach. "These women are my customers and my guests, Lieutenant. They're not required to answer your questions unless you're charging them with a crime. If you have legal business to conduct, bring proper warrants. Otherwise, I'm asking you to leave my property." The words were civil but firm, and they transformed Jake from neutral observer into active protector of Apache interests against white authority. Hayes' departure, accompanied by thinly veiled threats about consequences for those who obstructed military operations, left Jake shaking with a combination of fear and exhilaration. He'd just made an enemy of a military officer in a territory where such enmities could be dangerous, but he'd also demonstrated that his commitment to neutrality extended to situations where maintaining it required personal risk. The question was whether this demonstration would be seen by the watching warriors and the sisters as genuine principle or merely as a performance designed to maintain his trading post's reputation. Yanaha's reaction, delivered after Hayes and his patrol had disappeared from the canyon, surprised Jake with its directness and what might have been grudging respect. "You chose to oppose your own kind's authority to protect us from harassment. Perhaps my sister was not completely wrong about the possibility that some white men can prioritize justice over convenience." The words were hardly effusive praise, but coming from someone who had been openly skeptical of Jake's character, they represented significant acknowledgement. But it was Ayasha's explanation that evening that made Jake understand the full implications of what had happened and why the confrontation with Lieutenant Hayes had been a crucial moment in the test he'd been undergoing. She revealed that Hayes' arrival at the trading post hadn't been coincidental or simply routine patrol activity. The lieutenant had been informed about the sisters' presence by someone who wanted to create exactly the kind of situation that would test whether Jake's neutrality was genuine or merely performance. Our father needed to know whether his Daughters would be protected by your proclaimed neutrality when that protection required you to stand against your own people's authority, Ayasha explained. Many white traders claim to be fair and neutral, but they abandon those claims when military or civilian power demands they choose sides. You could have allowed Hayes to question us, could have provided information that would make him leave more quickly, could have protected your trading post's safety by cooperating with his demands. Instead, you chose to honor the sanctuary you'd offered us even when that choice carried personal risk. The revelation that Chief Cocheta had somehow arranged for Hayes to visit the trading post specifically to test Jake's response created a mix of emotions that Jake was still processing hours after the conversation ended. On one hand, he felt manipulated by being placed in a situation without his knowledge or consent, where his choices would have consequences far beyond his individual circumstances. On the other hand, he recognized that the chief's approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to evaluate whether white settlers' proclaimed values had substance beyond convenient situations. That the broader implications of Jake's confrontation with Hayes became clear over the following days as word spread through the territory about what had happened at the trading post. Some settlers viewed Jake's refusal to cooperate with military authority as betrayal of white interests and began avoiding his establishment, while others saw it as principled defense of property rights and individual liberty against government overreach. Military commanders noted Jake's name as someone whose loyalties were questionable, while Apache communities learned that at least one white trader was willing to risk personal consequences to honor protections he'd offered. The economic impact was immediate and significant, as enough settlers began boycotting Jake's trading post that his business suffered noticeably. The isolation that had previously been an asset for maintaining neutrality now became a liability, as customers who might have overlooked his defense of Apache guests found it easier to take their business elsewhere rather than defend their association with someone the military viewed with suspicion. Jake faced the real possibility that his principled stand would cost him the trading post he'd spent years building. But even as Jake's business declined and the economic pressure mounted, he recognized that backing down now would validate Yanaha's skepticism about whether white settlers could maintain principles when the costs became real. He'd been given a choice between comfortable neutrality that required no sacrifice and genuine commitment to justice that demanded personal risk, and he'd chosen the latter without fully understanding the consequences. The question that kept him awake at night was whether he would come to regret that choice or whether it represented the person he'd always wanted to be but had never been tested enough to become. As the first week of the sisters' stay at his trading post drew to a close, Jake understood that the test wasn't over, but had merely reached a new phase. He'd demonstrated willingness to defend Apache people against harassment when doing so meant opposing military authority, but the sacred decision Chief Cocheta was making about his community's future would require more than a single gesture of protection. What the chief needed to know was whether the principles Jake had displayed in that confrontation represented lasting commitment, or merely a momentary courage that would fade when the full costs of his choices became apparent. Chief Cocheta's arrival at the trading post on the 8th day of his daughter's stay brought a formality and weight that made clear this wasn't a casual visit, but rather a culmination of the testing period Jake had been unknowingly enduring. The chief came with a small group of warriors and elders, moving openly rather than with the stealth that had characterized the previous observers. Their arrival in daylight and with ceremonial bearing suggested they were making official contact rather than continuing covert surveillance. Jake's first impression of Chief Cocheta was of a man carrying immense responsibility, with visible strain but undiminished dignity. The chief appeared to be in his 50s, with gray threading through his long black hair and lines of worry and thought marking his weathered face. His clothing was traditional Apache work, combining practical utility with artistic beauty, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to leading people through impossible circumstances where every decision carried life or death weight for community members who depended on his judgment. The conversation that followed, conducted partly in English and partly through Ayasha's translation, revealed the full scope of what had been at stake during the sisters' stay at Jake's trading post, and why their observations would influence Chief Cocheta's decision about his community's future. The chief explained that he faced pressure from multiple directions. Military commanders demanded immediate relocation to San Carlos Reservation. Government Indian agents promised support and supplies if his people complied peacefully. Younger warriors wanted to continue resistance, despite increasingly impossible odds. And tribal elders counseled caution about decisions that would affect generations yet unborn. I sent my daughters here to learn whether white men's promises about fairness and respect have substance or are merely words used to facilitate our removal from lands we have occupied since the ancient times, Chief Cocheta said through Ayasha's translation, his dark eyes studying Jake with the intensity of someone trying to read character in facial expressions and body language. The decision I must make about whether to lead my people to the reservation or encourage them to continue fighting for our traditional territories depends partly on whether we can trust that life under white authority will be bearable or whether it will be slow death of Apache culture and dignity. Jake found himself struggling to respond honestly to a question that seemed to demand optimism he couldn't authentically provide. He'd heard enough stories about reservation conditions, witnessed enough broken promises from government officials, and understood enough about how settlers viewed Apache people to know that Chief Cocheta's concerns about reservation, life-destroying Apache culture weren't paranoid fears, but rather well-founded predictions based on clear patterns. Yet he also understood that continued resistance would likely lead to deaths, forced relocations under even worse conditions, and eventual destruction of the community through military action. I can't promise you that accepting relocation will preserve your people's way of life, because I've seen how reservations operate, and I know they're designed more to contain and control than to support cultural survival, Jake finally said, choosing painful honesty over comforting lies. What I can tell you is that some white people, not many but some, genuinely believe that Apache people deserve to be treated with dignity and have rights that should be respected. Whether those few people have enough influence to improve reservation conditions or prevent the worst abuses, I honestly don't know. The chief's response suggested he appreciated honesty even when it didn't provide the reassurance he might have hoped for. Your refusal to lie to me in order to influence my decision toward the path that benefits white interests shows the kind of respect my daughters reported seeing during their time at your trading post. But what I need to understand is not just whether individual white men like yourself can behave honorably, but whether white society as a whole can be trusted to allow people like you to influence how Apache people are treated once we are fully under your authority. This question cut to the heart of what Jake had been grappling with since his confrontation with Lieutenant Hayes and the economic consequences that had followed. He was just one person with a small trading post and a reputation for fairness, but he had no real power to influence territorial policy or prevent military commanders from implementing harsh measures against Apache communities. His principles meant something at the individual level but didn't translate into protections that a chief could rely on when making decisions about his people's collective future. This conversation continued throughout the afternoon, with Ayasha and Yanaha contributing their observations about Jake's behavior during their stay and the reactions of various customers to their presence. The sisters had compiled a remarkably detailed account of every interaction, every conflict managed or avoided, every choice Jake had made about how to balance competing interests and values. Their report was thorough enough to make Jake uncomfortable about how closely he'd been observed, but it also revealed the sophistication of the evaluation process Chief Cocheta had designed. What emerged from the discussion was that the chief's sacred decision wasn't simply about choosing between reservation life and continued resistance, but rather about determining what kind of relationship Apache people could have with white settlers if they chose accommodation over conflict. The test Jake had been undergoing was meant to provide data about whether that relationship could include genuine respect and mutual recognition of humanity, or whether it would inevitably be characterized by domination, exploitation, and cultural destruction regardless of individual settlers' good intentions. Yanaha's contribution to the conversation revealed that her skepticism about white settlers' trustworthiness had been somewhat modified by Jake's behavior during their stay. I came here believing that no white man would choose to sacrifice his own interests to protect Apache people when the choice became difficult, she admitted through Ayesha's translation. What I observed challenges that belief, but does not eliminate my concerns about whether one honorable trader represents a possibility for better relations or merely an exception. That proves the general rule about white settlers' attitudes toward my people. Chief Cocheta's judgment about Jake and what his trading post represented came late in the afternoon as the conversation was winding down. The chief's words, delivered with the formality of someone pronouncing a finding that would be remembered and transmitted to others, acknowledged both what Jake had demonstrated and the limitations of what any individual could accomplish against broader social and political forces. You have shown, my daughters, that some white men can honor their word and treat Apache people with dignity, even when doing so carries personal cost. This is valuable knowledge that will influence my counsel to my community, though it does not answer all the questions we must resolve in deciding our path forward. What you represent is possibility. The possibility that accommodation does not necessarily mean complete destruction of Apache ways, that some white people can be trusted to behave honorably, and that relationships based on mutual respect might exist even within the larger context of conquest and displacement. The chief's pronouncement was both validation and burden, as Jake recognized that his behavior during the sisters' stay had become evidence in arguments about Apache survival strategy. His defense of the sisters against Lieutenant Hayes, his management of conflicts with hostile customers, and his honest acknowledgement of limitations regarding his influence over territorial policy would all become part of stories and discussions, shaping how Chief Cocheta's community responded to relocation pressure. The responsibility of serving as an example of what was possible in Apache settler relations felt heavier than any business decision Jake had ever made. As Chief Cocheta prepared to depart with his daughters and the warriors who had been maintaining vigil, he offered Jake something that represented recognition of the trust that had been extended and honored. He gave Jake a small carved stone marked with symbols, indicating friendship and respected status within Apache communities that acknowledged his test. The chief explained that carrying this stone would mark Jake as someone who had been evaluated and found to be a person of integrity, someone whose trading post could be trusted and whose word had weight in negotiations and disputes. But the chief's final words before leaving carried a warning alongside the honor. What you have earned through your treatment of my daughters is respect, but respect creates obligations. When others learn that Chief Cocheta has declared you a man of integrity, they will expect you to live up to that assessment. The test you passed by protecting my daughters was only the beginning of what will be expected from someone who carries the mark of our trust. As Jake watched Chief Cocheta and his group disappear into the canyon, he felt the weight of transformation from neutral trader to someone whose character had been publicly proclaimed and whose future choices would be judged against standards he'd helped establish through passing a test he hadn't known he was taking. The sacred decision the chief was making about his community's future had become connected to decisions Jake would make about how to use whatever influence his reputation provided. And the watching that had characterized the sisters' visit hadn't ended, but had merely changed. As Jake's actions would continue to be observed and evaluated by communities who would measure his ongoing behavior against the principles he'd demonstrated during those crucial days. 3 months after Chief Cocheta's visit, Jake's trading post had become something different from what it had been before the sisters' arrival. The carved stone the chief had given him sat prominently on the trading post counter, and its presence communicated to Apache visitors that this was a place where they could expect genuine fairness rather than the suspicious tolerance or outright hostility they encountered at most establishments serving white settlers. But the stone's message also created expectations that Jake was still learning to navigate. As being publicly recognized as a person of integrity by an Apache chief carried obligations. He hadn't fully anticipated the economic consequences of Jake's confrontation with Lieutenant Hayes had stabilized at a new equilibrium that reflected the trading post's changed identity. He'd lost customers among settlers who viewed his defense of the Apache sisters as betrayal of white interests. But he'd gained business from Apache communities who had previously been cautious about trading at an establishment run by a white man. The financial shift wasn't entirely positive. Apache traders generally had less cash and traded more in goods than the settler customers Jake had lost. But the moral satisfaction of operating a genuinely neutral trading post that served all communities fairly made up for some of the economic pressure. What Jake hadn't expected was how much Chief Cocheta's public recognition of his integrity would draw him into disputes and conflicts extending far beyond his trading post. Apache people began coming to him, seeking advice about dealings with government agents, asking him to witness agreements to ensure fair translation, and requesting his testimony about incidents where white authorities accused Apache individuals of violations. The carved stone that marked him as a trusted person created responsibilities for mediating between communities that Jake had previously avoided despite his neutral ground. The most significant challenge came when Chief Cocheta sent word that he wanted Jake present during negotiations with Indian Agent Harrison Miller about the terms under which his community might accept relocation to San Carlos Reservation. The chief had decided, after months of deliberation influenced partly by what his daughters had observed at Jake's trading post, to explore reservation life rather than continue resistance that was becoming increasingly untenable. But he wanted someone present who could verify that promises made during negotiations were accurately recorded and honestly represented. Someone whose integrity was trusted by both Apache community members and white authorities. Jake's instinct was to refuse, recognizing that serving as witness to reservation negotiations would involve him in political matters far more complex and dangerous than running a neutral trading post. But the carved stone sitting on his counter represented obligations he'd accepted by passing the test Chief Cocheta had designed, and refusing to help now would invalidate everything he'd demonstrated during the sisters' stay. The burden of honor he'd earned through his treatment of Ayasha and Yanaha included exactly these kinds of requests for involvement in matters where his reputation for fairness could serve purposes beyond his personal interests. The negotiations Jake witnessed over 3 days of careful discussions revealed the full complexity of what Chief Cocheta was trying to achieve and why the chief's sacred decision had required such thorough evaluation of whether white promises could be trusted. Indian Agent Miller made extensive commitments about supplies, land allocations, and protections that would be provided if Cocheta's community relocated peacefully to San Carlos. The promises sounded reasonable and even generous, but Jake's experience with frontier politics made him skeptical about whether the agent had either the authority or the genuine intention to fulfill what he was offering. Jake's role in the negotiations initially was simply to observe and verify that Apache participants understood what was being proposed. But as discussions progressed, Miller began making statements that diverged from what had been written in official documents. The agent would orally promise more generous terms, while ensuring the written agreements contained vaguer language that could be interpreted more restrictively. When Jake pointed out these discrepancies and insisted that oral promises either be included in written documents or formally withdrawn, Miller's attitude toward him shifted from cautious cooperation to barely concealed hostility. The confrontation that defined Jake's role in the negotiations came when Miller tried to include provisions that would severely restrict Apache movement even within reservation boundaries, essentially creating a prison rather than a protected homeland. The language was buried in technical clauses about security and administration, but Jake recognized it as creating conditions that would make traditional Apache practices impossible and force complete dependence on government supplies. His insistence on explaining these implications to Chief Cocheta in clear terms, over Miller's objections that he was exceeding his role as witness, transformed the negotiation dynamic entirely. You were brought here to verify translation accuracy, not to advocate for Apache interests or interpret the political implications of administrative provisions, Miller said angrily, after Jake had finished explaining how the movement restriction clauses would function in practice. "Your interference is making it impossible to reach an agreement that serves everyone's interests, including the Apache people, who would benefit from the security and support that relocation provides." Jake's response, delivered in front of Chief Cocheta, his daughters, tribal elders, and the witnesses Miller had brought to the negotiations, established a principle he knew would have lasting consequences for his life in Arizona territory. "My role is to ensure honest communication, which includes making sure both sides understand not just the words being used, but their practical implications. If explaining what provisions actually mean rather than what they're claimed to mean is interference, then I'm guilty as charged. But I'd rather be accused of interfering than participate in creating agreements based on misunderstandings that will lead to conflict and bitterness when Apache people realize they accepted terms different from what they thought was being offered." The negotiations eventually produced an agreement that included clearer language and fewer restrictive provisions than what Miller had initially proposed, largely because Jake's presence made it impossible for the agent to rely on vague promises and misleading explanations. But the cost to Jake was significant, as Miller made clear that he would report to territorial authorities that the trading post operator had obstructed Indian affairs and advocated for Apache interests over government policy. The warning was clear. Jake's involvement in matters beyond his trading post had created official enemies whose influence extended throughout Arizona territorial government. Chief Cocheta's gratitude for Jake's advocacy during the negotiations was profound, but came with acknowledgement that Jake had sacrificed much of his comfortable neutrality by choosing to ensure honest dealing. "You have honored the trust marked by the stone I gave you, but you have also made yourself a target for those who profit from dishonest negotiations and exploitative treatment of Apache people," the chief said, as the negotiation sessions concluded. "The sacred decision I made about leading my people to the reservation was influenced by knowing that at least some white men will work to ensure promises are kept, rather than we're merely used as tools to facilitate our removal. But your advocacy has cost you the safety of claiming neutrality, and I fear the consequences you will face because you chose to honor our trust." The full implications of those consequences became apparent over the following months as Jake's trading post faced increasing pressure from multiple directions. Military patrols began inspecting his operations more frequently, looking for technical violations that could justify sanctions or closure. Settler customers who had remained loyal despite his defense of the Apache sisters now faced social pressure to boycott an establishment whose operator was viewed as an Apache advocate rather than a neutral trader. Even some Apache communities expressed concern that Jake's overt involvement in their affairs might be drawing attention that made his trading post less useful as a neutral meeting ground. Tayasha and Yanaha visited the trading post several times during this difficult period, bringing supplies from their community and offering support that went beyond simple commerce. They had observed Jake's advocacy during the negotiations their father had conducted, and they understood better than most what he had sacrificed by choosing to ensure honest dealing rather than maintaining comfortable neutrality. Their visits were partly practical assistance to a trading post whose business had suffered, but they were also public demonstrations that Apache communities valued integrity and remembered those who had honored their trust. The conversation Jake had with the sisters during one of their visits helped him understand how his actions during the negotiations had influenced Apache perspectives on the reservation decision their father had made. Yanaha, whose skepticism about white settlers had been only partially modified by Jake's treatment of them during their initial stay, acknowledged that his advocacy had provided evidence that some white people would prioritize justice over convenience, even when doing so carried significant personal cost. "I told my father that your treatment of us at the trading post proved nothing except that individual white men could behave honorably when circumstances made it easy," Yanaha said, her English now more fluent after months of increased contact with settlers through her father's negotiations. "But your advocacy during the treaty discussions showed something different, that you would risk everything you built to ensure Apache people were not deceived by false promises." This gave my father confidence that perhaps accommodation with white society would not inevitably mean complete destruction of Apache ways and dignity. Ayesha's perspective added nuance to her sister's assessment, acknowledging both what Jake had demonstrated and the limitations of what any individual could accomplish against broader social and political forces. The sacred decision my father made was not based entirely on what you showed us, but you provided evidence that influenced how he counseled our people about their future. He could tell them honestly that some white people can be trusted, that honest dealings are possible even within the larger context of displacement and loss, and that maintaining dignity and cultural identity might be achievable even in reservation life if there are people like you willing to ensure promises are kept. The reality of Chief Cocheta's communities. Relocation to San Carlos Reservation provided a test of whether the negotiations Jake had helped shape would actually produce the more humane conditions the chief had been promised. Jake made regular visits to the reservation, despite the personal risk involved, monitoring whether supplies were provided as agreed, whether movement restrictions were being enforced fairly, and whether the Apache families who had relocated were being treated with the dignity that had been promised. His continued involvement cost him business and created ongoing tension with territorial authorities, but he understood that abandoning his advocacy after the negotiations would validate all the skepticism about white trustworthiness that Yanaha had expressed during her initial stay at his trading post. The most meaningful validation of Jake's choices came nearly a year after the sisters' first visit, when Chief Cocheta asked him to witness a ceremony marking the first anniversary of his community's relocation. The ceremony was traditional Apache ritual, combined with acknowledgement of new circumstances, honoring both the ancestral ways that were being adapted and the relationships that were being built with those white settlers who had shown themselves worthy of trust. During the ceremony, Chief Cocheta spoke about the sacred decision he had made and the factors that had influenced his counsel to his people. He acknowledged the losses that relocation had required. Traditional territories abandoned, hunting and gathering practices curtailed, dependence on government supplies increased, but he also pointed to what had been preserved, community cohesion maintained, cultural practices continued within new constraints, and most importantly, the dignity of making their own choice about adaptation rather than having terms imposed through military defeat and forced removal. The decision to come to this reservation was sacred because it determined the future of our people and the world our children will inherit, the chief said through translation, his words carrying the weight of leadership responsibility fully embraced. That decision was influenced by many factors, but among them was evidence provided by a white trader who showed my daughters that some settlers honor their word, and who later showed all of us that promises could be kept when people of integrity ensured honest dealing. Jacob Brennan's trading post remains neutral ground, but he himself is no longer neutral about whether Apache people deserve justice and respect. This transformation from neutral observer to active advocate represents the kind of relationship between our peoples that makes adaptation to new circumstances bearable rather than merely a slow death of Apache identity. As Jake stood before the assembled community receiving formal recognition for his role in helping shape conditions that made reservation life more humane than it might otherwise have been, he felt the full weight of the transformation that had begun when two Apache sisters arrived at his trading post, seeking shelter. He had been tested without knowing it, had passed that test through choices that reflected his genuine values, and had then been drawn into obligations and responsibilities far beyond anything he'd anticipated when first offering hospitality to two travelers. The carved stone that Chief Cocheta had given him still sat on his trading post counter, but it now represented something more complex than simple recognition of integrity. It marked Jake as someone who had sacrificed comfortable neutrality to ensure that trust was honored and promises were kept. Someone who understood that being recognized as a person of integrity created obligations to use whatever influence that recognition provided in service of justice rather than merely personal interests. The trading post continued to operate, though on a smaller scale and with a different mix of customers than before the sisters' visit. Apache families from San Carlos came regularly, bringing trade goods and using the establishment as a connection point between reservation life and the broader territorial economy. Settler customers who valued principle over prejudice continued to support the business, while those who viewed Apache advocacy as betrayal took their commerce elsewhere. The economic reality was more precarious than it had been, but the moral satisfaction of operating a genuinely neutral ground that served justice rather than merely facilitating commerce made the sacrifice worthwhile. As Jake reflected on everything that had changed since Ayasha and Yanaha had first walked into his trading post, he understood that the sacred decision Chief Cochetta had made about his community's future had become connected to decisions Jake himself had made about what kind of person he wanted to be and what his trading post would represent. The test he'd been subjected to without his knowledge had revealed character he'd always hoped he possessed, but had never been challenged enough to prove. And the obligations that recognition had created were shaping his life in ways that made simple neutrality impossible. The two Apache sisters who had started it all visited occasionally, bringing news from the reservation and maintaining the relationship that had been forged during those crucial days when Jake was being evaluated for his integrity and trustworthiness. Their presence at his trading post reminded him that the choices individuals made about how to treat people from different communities could influence decisions affecting entire peoples, and that sometimes the most important tests were the ones you didn't know you were taking until after you'd already passed or failed them based on who you really were rather than who you claimed to be. The burden of honor that Jake carried, symbolized by the carved stone and embodied in the expectations placed on him by communities who trusted his advocacy, was heavier than anything he'd anticipated when he first established his trading post in the canyon. But it was also more meaningful than the comfortable neutrality he'd practiced before understanding that remaining silent in the face of injustice was itself a choice with moral weight and consequences that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. The sacred decision that Chief Cochetta had placed at the center of Jake's life continued to shape his daily choices, his relationships with diverse communities, and his understanding of what it meant to operate a trading post that claimed to serve as neutral ground in a region where neutrality increasingly required active advocacy for justice rather than passive acceptance of systems designed to exploit and displace vulnerable peoples. And through it all, Jake carried the knowledge that two Apache sisters had seen in him, possibilities he hadn't fully recognized in himself, and that their father's trust had transformed his life in ways that could never be reversed, but which represented the person he'd always wanted to become.